And Iran cannot do much with that bomb except threaten it. Because if they are going to use it, it's going to hurt them, it's going to hurt their allies. And the argument goes, we lived with Russia, we lived with China, and now we are living with North Korea. So why not Iran? I mean, do you have any idea about whether this is discussed within the administration or not? Or?
This is the one taboo that the administration doesn't want to touch. This is what they would be very vulnerable. This is what the Republicans are accusing Obama of doing, saying that you are more afraid of bombing Iran than an Iranian bomb. So there is a reason why there hasn't been a conversation, a rational conversation, about could there be deterrence with Iran? Could one live with, I mean, obviously, in my opinion, it would be an extremely negative development. I don't see the increase of nuclear weapons in Iran or anywhere else in the region as a positive thing. But there is a deliberately, a politically motivated level of hysteria when it comes to this debate. And I can explain some theories as to why that exists. But the bottom line result of that hysteria is that we are actually minimizing our own options and our own maneuverability, so the only options remaining are confrontational options. Listen to what some of the neoconservatives say when they're on TV, or some of the hawks say. They're asked a question, they don't answer the question, instead they give a long list of why the Iranians and all the bad things they've done. All of them true. But what was that? What was the logical connection between that and why we actually had to invade and go into that country for 8 years, and we see how we have suffered from that? It's the same tactic you see on the debates today. If there was a rational conversation about this, I think it would bring us to a situation in which we could have more decision-making space, as the Pentagon calls it. And we could consider various solutions. I mentioned earlier on that there is an obvious solution. That obvious solution is that the ultimate compromise is that the Iranians will have to accept that there's going to be limitations to their nuclear program, meaning there cannot be any enrichment above 5%. On the other hand, the West would have to accept that there is some enrichment in Iran. Moreover, there would have to be the implementation of the additional protocol, massive inspections, verification, transparency, to create a firewall, a next to impenetrable firewall, between Iran having peaceful nuclear energy and Iran having a weapons technology. And hopefully, perhaps, add to that, that Iran would not be able to stockpile LEU above 1,000 kilos. Because if they can't do that, then any real risk for a breakthrough is going to take such a long time that it actually would be detected very early. To give an example, right now, if the Iranians were to reconfigure the centrifuges at Natanz and reconfigure them in such a way that they would do higher level enrichment, it would take about 30 to 60 days for the IAEA to find out. And that's not sufficient for them to actually build the bomb. If the additional protocol was implemented, however, if the Iranians were to do something of this nature, the IAEA would find out within 24 hours. So there's significant value in some of these solutions. The problem is, I can only think of 4 nations that at least, if they wouldn't entirely not accept it, they would definitely resist it quite extensively. And those nations are Saudi Arabia, Israel, France, and the UK. I believe the Obama administration would accept it. I also believe that the Iranians potentially would accept it. But the administration right now, when they're putting together proposals, the first point of resistance that they're meeting is actually from France. The administration is far more flexible in what they are. And it's a very uncomfortable position for a US government to be out-hawked by the French. That doesn't look good for you.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
How much of the administration's policies toward Iran is influenced by Israel?
And I think Israel is a very significant factor. And in fact, the administration is on record. I have them quoted in my book saying so, that this is one of the most important factors that they consider when formulating their policy towards Iran. So I don't think there's any denying of that. The problem has been that the Obama administration and Israel have essentially been at odds with each other from the very, very beginning. 24 hours after Obama won the election, then Israeli foreign minister, who's considered a moderate, Tzipi Livni, is interviewed by Israeli radio, and she's asked what she thinks of Obama's election victory and the idea of negotiating with Iran. And she says that in this region, being willing to talk is considered a sign of weakness. The interviewer asked her, does this mean that you oppose Obama's idea of negotiations? And she says, yes, point, full stop. There was no support for this from Israel. And once Netanyahu came into power, there was even greater tension, because as you know, Obama also pushed on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. This was really shaking up the Israeli-American relationship, because on the two key issues in which there are some tensions, Obama took the opposite side of Israel. He was pushing for a Palestinian state, at least originally, and he was pushing against settlement expansion, was pushing for getting talks about a settlement kick-started. It didn't last very long, but at least that's what he initially tried to do. And then on Iran, he was pushing for negotiations. Netanyahu's government used 4 variables to try to make this as difficult as possible for the administration. 1, they were pushing for sanctions to be imposed before the negotiations. And the administration viewed that as a very negative development, because they thought in order to have any chance of successfully getting talks to be taken seriously, if you're actually sanctioning them before talks begin, that's going to undermine any trust or any willingness for serious talks. Secondly, they imposed on the talks an objective that Obama did not ever state, which is, we support diplomacy because it's going to end the Iranian nuclear program, meaning going back to zero enrichment. That was setting the bar at a level in which diplomacy essentially was a non-starter. Thirdly, the Israelis pushed for talks to last no longer than 12 weeks, saying that if the talks lasted longer than that, that would give the Iranians an opportunity to play for time. So sanctions that had failed to do anything positive on this issue for 20 years, instead now diplomacy had to fix all of this in 12 weeks. Also something that made it much more difficult for diplomacy to succeed. And the last point was that while the administration, as I said, tried to change the atmospherics and tried to create an environment that was not defined by threat and threatening language, and the administration tried to avoid saying that all options are on the table. They tried to demilitarize the atmosphere. The Israelis made the argument that the Iranians are not going to negotiate unless there is a credible military threat on the table. So as the Obama administration were trying to demilitarize, the Israelis instead increased their rhetoric and their militaristic rhetoric in order to get an opposite effect. This was very visible during the first press conference between Obama and Netanyahu in May 2009. It's a very tense press conference. It's quite clear these two guys do not like each other. And then Obama, this is the one point that I referred to earlier on, spells out the strategic rationale for diplomacy, saying that wars and threats and sanctions have not achieved anything, that's why we want to try diplomacy. Then it gets to be, and he didn't say anything about the military threat or the military option. Then it's Netanyahu's turn. He takes the microphone, he thanks the president for his commitment to Israeli security and the strong friendship, and then he thanks the president for guaranteeing that the military option is still on the table. Something that Obama had not said at all during the press conference, deliberately avoided because he wanted to demilitarize the atmosphere. Now, it's difficult to say exactly how much the influence is, but I would make this argument though. Even though the Israelis were very concerned about diplomacy, and even though they went to great lengths to try to make it more difficult, as I write in the book, the biggest blow to Obama's political space to pursue this was not what the Israelis did in 2009, it's what the Iranians did in the election scandal. That was a bigger problem and cost Obama more time than the Israeli action.
Back there, but yeah.
As an Iranian, we interpret that as Syria is gone, which is the biggest ally of the mullahs, then it's going to be their turn. Now I'm having an Iranian American like yourself standing in front of us, telling us, no, sanctions don't work, let's practice diplomacy. A lot of people accuse you that you are lobbying for the regime of Iran and you are trying to buy time for the mullahs. And I tend to agree with them, because I see that's what you're doing. I'm happy that the sanctions are going on because I think that they are going to weaken the government of Iran, and one day the people of Iran are going to have democracy in Iran.
First of all, I don't think there is any support amongst the Iranian American public, as you mentioned, as you're a member of it, for the type of situation that we currently see in Syria, in which you essentially have a civil war and things are, and what the Assad government is doing and massacring its own people and the many, many people that are dying. Polls in the Iranian American community. Hold on, let me answer the question.
Syria for freedom.
Well, that's a generous and charitable interpretation of massacres that are currently taking place. Polls in the Iranian American community have shown consistently that support for military action is less than 3% in the Iranian American community. That's not a surprise, mindful of the fact that we have seen what has happened in Afghanistan. We have seen what has happened in Iraq. And in fact, seeing what is happening in Syria. I don't think that is an attractive option for anyone truly seeking democracy. And then we can take the issue of sanctions. I'm glad you raised that issue. Sanctions have become an issue that, because of the actions of the Iranian government, because of the masses' abuses, there is a very justified anger in the community against the regime. And there is a frustration because there doesn't seem to be any good options on how you actually deal with this in a time-effective way. And I think that has caused a certain gravitation to believing that sanctions could actually resolve this. It's not war, at least it doesn't come across as war, and the hope is that that will bring down the regime. And I think that is understandable, but when you actually take a look at the empirical evidence, what is this track record of sanctions, not changing a regime, but actually bringing about democracy, ending the nightmare that the Iranian people have been living in for so long? Then it is quite a different picture. There's 10 countries that have been under the type of embargo-like sanctions that currently are now being put in place in Iran. Out of those 10 countries, only one has transitioned to democracy and given up its nuclear program, and that is South Africa. And even in that case, there is a very heated academic debate whether the sanctions were helpful or not helpful. In the 9 other cases, you have had the repressive regimes become more repressive, become more undemocratic, becoming more destabilizing. In the case of Iraq, ending up with an invasion, which was even more disastrous. In the case of North Korea, arguably evading war by actually testing a nuclear weapon. Then you compare it to the states that have transitioned to democracy in the last 50 or so years. Since 1955, I believe, to now, we have 35 states that have transitioned from an autocratic system to democracy. Out of those 35 states, only one was under an embargo of the nature, of the intensity that the Iranians are soon going to be facing. The 34 others transitioned from dictatorships to democracy in the absence of such sanctions. Now, that is just an empirical track record. Perhaps one can still make a hope. There's some people currently saying that we're seeing some movement in the Burma case, and then they're pointing to the sanctions as a result of that. What is interesting then, of course, and they're saying, making the argument, sanctions provide short-term pain for long-term gain. Well, even if we were to assume that the fact that the Burmese now invited Clinton to Burma, which is a positive step and there seems to be a movement, well, we're very, very far away from actually having a democracy in Burma. But nevertheless, that happened after more than 20 years of sanctions, because the sanctions on Burma, the embargo was put in place in 1988. We're talking about 24 years. That's hardly short-term pain for long-term gain. So the track record on that, I don't think, is particularly convincing. Whether that then is satisfying on an emotional level, I think is a different question. I don't think there is any doubt that in the Iranian American community, and I would say also inside of Iran, there is a desire to be able to have a different regime. This regime has, in my view, and in the view of many, I think, lost legitimacy. It's incompetent, it is corrupt, it has not managed to bring Iran to what its potential would deserve it to be. The question is, how do you do this? How do you get to that point? And it's very, very difficult. Prior to 2009, there was more confidence that this could be done peacefully, through the ballot box, through indigenous change. After 2009, obviously, that confidence took a heavy, heavy beating. But that taking a heavy beating did not automatically, in any way, shape, or form, change the track record of sanctions. I think I mentioned earlier on that we need to have a dispassionate, non-hysterical conversation about this. Making accusations such as, oh, you're a lobbyist for this or that, because you disagree with a conclusion, or because it's difficult to come up with facts that would support one's position, is not helping bring about a conversation in which we actually can find solutions. All it is doing is raising the emotional level, getting people to get down into their positions and make them immune to reason. And ultimately, the only ones that benefit from that are the regime in Iran themselves. Thank you. Thank you so much. You know the dimensions of the problem. About it in the previous book, and what the Iranians are doing. Don't have it. I'm retired.
We have 1 acre.
I enjoyed your speech. Thank you. And I think I'm afraid that the deliberate.
My concern is when you talk about the Israeli.
In other words, a little bit of excitement.
Sometimes, you know.
The Israelis do not. Thank you. Okay, so I'm rolling. Just count to 5 in your head, maybe a little smile or something.